Hello, and welcome to SimPvP Histories, Architecture Edition. SimPvP is a survival Minecraft server which has existed on the same map since 2011. Over the course of 8 years, the server has developed a unique history. Come explore the various chapters of that history in these episodes of The Complete History of SimPvP.
I don't know why. We may not be perfect, but heaven knows we try. But all around, even our old friends put us down. Let's drop the big one and see what happens.
Acapella, legal notice. Well, today we finally do it. Today we cover Imperial Architecture on SimPvP. Now, this is gonna be a long one, so grab some snacks. Well, first, you should start with the basics. Sindisfarne. According to the SimPvP wiki, quote, Sindisfarne was a base created by Cinnabars with help from Pippenger on an island in the general vicinity of Spawn in early 2013. When Cinnabars left the server for many months after its completion, Pippenger went on to found the similar base Caladan on a nearby island. At Sindisfarne, an early Proto-Imperial Architecture style began to develop, and sure enough, this is clear from the images provided. Notice the use of stone brick as a prominent building block in the construction of Sindisfarne. This is very similar to later Imperial Architecture designs of bases. However, the base lacks the complexity and detail that is common in later Imperial Architecture. For example, where are the columns and the features on the side of walls that are typical in Imperial Architecture? Yes, indeed, the architecture present at Sindisfarne is not Imperial Architecture. In fact, it would more accurately described as Cinnapip architecture, from the strong influence from Cinnabar in the construction and architectural style. Since it was Pippenger himself who created this document that I use to link bases and their styles together, I feel that it is appropriate to mention the 3 main pillars that Pippenger himself describes as influences in his style, Imperial Architecture. The first is Cinnapip architecture, obviously. The next was Imperial Architecture itself, as described by Pippenger. And finally, another influence was Josephian architecture. However, it didn't really come into play until much later. These 3 styles form a large cluster in the center of the map provided by Pippenger himself. That could be described as the Imperial Architecture sphere, drawing influences from all across different types of architectural styles on the server, from different time periods and from different players. In fact, another strong influence on this Imperial style sphere of influence would be Morlock's style. However, that is only in certain bases, and the 3 pillars of Imperial style interchange their features in high frequencies. The evolution of Imperial Architecture continues in mid-2013 with the building and founding of Caladan by Pippenger. Now, this small, almost insignificant looking base would have a lot of influence on the server and the history of the server. One reason for this was the vast amount of players who based at Caladan. There was Pippenger himself, Enchanter 96, Rumpslem, an old, well-known player, James Jed, Egg Thief, another well-known old player, Magenta, and, according to the wiki, SimPvP wiki, quote, and many others. In addition to the sheer amount of players who based there, Caladan was also one of the founding bases of the Empire, Pippinger's first clan on SimPvP. Pippenger created the Empire with the primary objective of creating the most populous and largest group on SimPvP. In addition to that, he also wanted to provide noobs with gear and food to survive, so that they would be indebted to him. In the end, this is one of his many plans for server domination. However, one small thing would thwart Pippenger in his rise to power on the server, and that was Pippinger's lust for architectural perfection. Yes. Now, initially, everything was going okay with Pippenger. He would invite many new players to his base at Caladan to build with him, and, at first, he would allow them to build as they pleased. But, as more and more new players joined, he began to feel as if the building style which they chose to build in was detracting from the overall aesthetic quality of his own castle at Caladan. So, fueled by a lust for architectural perfection, Pippenger implemented strict building guidelines. Quote, the building codes. The first major crisis in Imperial history came late in the summer, when many of the new residents of Caladan began building additions to the castle. Pippenger was dissatisfied with some of these additions, which were stylistically divergent from, and sometimes inferior to, Pippinger's castle. The building codes were highly restrictive, mandating that materials could and could not be used in construction. The codes proved unpopular both within the team and on the forums, and the Empire began to gain enemies both within and without. Betrayal. Shortly after this, an unknown player attacked the castle with lava. The residents scattered, many leaving the team, and the Empire never recovered the high population it had enjoyed during the summer of 2013. Caladan was later replaced by the inferior castles Verdolaga, Tamarisk, and Kudzu. Later on, the capital of the Empire became the city of New Caladan, outquote from the SimPvP wiki. As you can see, players on SimPvP don't like being told what to do, and Pippenger made his first mistake, and that was telling them what to do. Although Pippinger's methods of creating uniformity in architecture were seen by most to be disruptive, they did prove influential on the server. Tamarisk and Cathedral were both highly inspired by Castle Caladan, and thus the Josephian architecture branch of Imperial architecture was further strengthened. Now, if Sindisfarne and Castle Caladan both represented proto-imperial architecture on SimPvP, now New Caladan, the new capital of the Empire, represented true imperial architecture. As we can see from this image, it is highly divergent from the initial proto-imperial designs seen in Sindisfarne and even in Castle Caladan. Notice these small buildings with their openings for windows and the stylistic stone brick details on their outside walls, which give them a level of texture. Yes, it is clear, just by looking at New Caladan, that the Empire was down, but it was not yet out for the count. The player member list is quite extensive for New Caladan as well, boasting some very popular and influential players among its ranks. Pippenger, Dakadoc, Iquint, Alexinov, Idripik, however you pronounce that, Captain Crunch, oh geez, Kilky Grey Dragon, Brock, Morlock, the castle builder from early SimPvP, and Diflo Vespar. No doubt, even though I have butchered many of those names in pronunciation, they are still highly recognizable as influential SimPvP players. Clearly, New Caladan was far more impressive than any of Pippinger's previous projects. However, none of the majesty of New Caladan could protect it from Pippinger's folly in his government. You see, many players believed that Pippenger was maybe a little bit too authoritarian in nature in his bases, and they didn't really agree with the way that he ran them, and eventually this would bite him in the ass. As it did with Caladan, it did with New Caladan, finally putting an end to the empire. Soon the city adopted a democratic system of government, which seemed to serve them better for the time being. However, none of these new changes could save the city ultimately. In February of 2014, it was griefed by a, quote, unknown, outquote, player known as Horus, and it never really recovered after that. Attempts were made to repair the base, but it was subsequently griefed again in 2015. To say that New Caladan was an inspiration to a lot of bases, honestly, was an understatement. In fact, the number of bases that it inspired, I literally would have to make this video like 3 hours long if I wanted to talk about every single one of them in detail, so I'll just cover a few of them in brief. Kosa in 2014, Island's Hope, also in 2014, Haven in 2014 and 2015, Strawman Temple, Forstestad, Ascaris, Aggersel, Stonetown, Argamoni, Pandora. Later, in 2017, Oberstein, and in 2018, finally, Mahula. And mind you, I'm not going to cover those bases not because there's not a lot to talk about. In fact, for a lot of those bases, there is quite a lot to talk about. I'm not going to cover those bases simply because they're nothing compared to the others on this list, and there are just so many bases in the Imperial architectural sphere that if I were to talk about every single one of them, well, let's just say it, nobody would watch this entire video. I mean, it's already at over 11 minutes. One of the bases that were directly inspired by New Caladan was Ascaris, built and founded in 2014. And you know what? I think the SimPvP wiki says it best. Quote, Ascaris was one of the vastest, oldest, and most notable cities to be built on this server, outquote. And that is a true statement if you've ever seen Ascaris. Now, I have, both after it was griefed and before it was, through a world download. And let me just say, impressive doesn't even begin to describe this base, even in part. It gets even better once you realize that this was built on SimPvP, yes, a server that not only is almost purely vanilla, but also doesn't allow you to hack at all, or dupe. So no dupes, no hacks, just pure vanilla survival, pretty much. And Pippenger and his friend Cinnabars were able to build this massive city over the period of almost 5 years. Now, in addition to being extremely huge and massive, and a pinnacle in the architectural style known as Classical Imperial, as designated by Pippenger himself on SimPvP, Ascaris also has its own vast history as well, which was outlined in my video on Ascaris that I made a few months back. However, there still is a lot to be talked about with Ascaris' history, so I'll just mention a few things. Now, yes, Pippenger did build at the base initially, but he was extremely helped out by his friend Cinnabars at the base, who did most of the early construction, as I was informed by him in my previous video's comments, or something to that effect, either the comments or the Discord, when I had said that Pippenger almost on his own had built the entire base, which obviously is not true. All that being said, it is still unknown who griefed the base, Ascaris, in late 2019. The world may never know. Now, after Ascaris, and concurrent to its construction, was Virunum, or Virunum, or whatever you want to call it, I guess, Virilium. It's all the same base, honestly, was founded in the summer of 2015. These days, Virilium is known for being the ending point for the Holy Wilbur Francis Memor, where the final battle was captured and filmed by Nagel101 and uploaded to his YouTube channel in October of 2019. Now, at this point, we have reached the height of Imperial architecture on SimPvP. After this point, it seems to become diluted with other people's styles more and more, as we see with bases such as Struthio, Florestria, and Yttrium. In addition, other influences, such as that of my own style in New Postopia, Zymaricopoly, and Aditharius, have also influenced the modern conception of Imperial architecture on Sim. In spite of this, on other servers such as 24cc, Pippenger, or his other alts such as Parkington, the Fallgrader, Senator Bix, etc., have been building and continuing the tradition of improving on the classical Imperial style, creating the late Imperial style. Made distinct by its builds of immense size, columns, domes, use of other blocks, stained glass, and a return to more freeform architecture. Late Imperial architecture, as defined by Pippenger, is quite impressive and offers a level of detail which is not present in classical Imperial architecture. This type of style of Imperial architecture first started in 2017 on SimPvP when Pippenger returned from his brief hiatus after the doxing scandal and implementation of Rule 3 on the server. This new style, in 2017, was dubbed by Pippenger himself as Neo-Imperial architecture. Perhaps the best example of this form of Imperial architecture is found at Siguria in these images provided by Pippenger himself. My goodness, would you look at the time, I haven't even covered pretty much half of the bases that are listed as connected to each other in the Imperial architecture sphere. Well, anyways, you get the gist. If you are walking around on SimPvP aimlessly and find a base, chances are it will most likely be some form of Imperial architecture at that base. Anyways, I've been Lord Pasta. This has been SimPvP Architecture Miniseries, and I will have to say, goodbye. Others, outquote.